I now have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished speaker, Father Stephen Fields. Father Fields is the Hackett Professor of Theology at Georgetown University. And at this point, I normally would say something about a speaker's academic degrees, but this is kind of a hard thing with Father Fields because he has 9 academic degrees. So he's got a PhD in philosophy from Yale. He has a terminal degree, a licentiate in sacred theology from the Weston School of Theology, and he has 5 master's degrees, one of them being from Oxford, and he also is a graduate of another Jesuit institution besides Weston. He was an undergrad at Loyola in Maryland. Now, I say all that to give you a sense of this man's greatness, but he also is a very humble man and someone who speaks in an accessible way. His students, I looked him up on Rate My Professor last night, and his students describe him as quote-unquote awesome, as lectures that are quote-unquote super interesting, as someone who is engaging and who makes theology super accessible. Another student said, "He is my favorite professor. I learned a ton." And finally, my favorite one, he is the gem of the Georgetown Theology Department. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Father Fields.
Thank you so much, Danny and John. It's such a pleasure for me to finally make it to this very handsome school. I've taught any number of alumni of this school at Georgetown over the 30 years that I've been there, and they have acquitted you and the school very well, and it's just a pleasure to be here to speak in this room that Father Don Rowe, whom I remember meeting so many years ago, built and designed. I would like to speak with you, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of my talk is pro and con. Does faith ignore reason? Does faith ignore reason? Now, you know, every Sunday when we go to church, Christians like us profess what we call the Nicene Creed. It generally comes after the homily and before the offertory, and it's filled with a whole series of claims that we make, propositions that we say at the very beginning. I believe the following. I believe in one God. I believe that there is a Trinity. I believe that the Son of God became a human being. I believe that the death that Jesus died on the cross saves us. I believe that Jesus has risen from the dead, that there is to be the forgiveness of sins, and that we too will have a bodily resurrection, and that we will enjoy life everlasting. And when we profess these things, when we stand up after the homily and we say all of these things, prefaced by the word I believe, we are effectively acknowledging all of these things to be true, that we do indeed accept them, and that we pledge in some way to live our life in accord with all of these claims and propositions. But a big problem immediately arises. What is the evidence for all of these things that we believe, that we profess, that we acknowledge to be true? Well, on the one hand, we could, of course, offer good evidence for the truth of the one God. After all, there are many great philosophers who have done so, people like Plato and Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, Descartes, and a host of contemporary thinkers. I spend a good part of my life actually teaching those arguments to our first-year students in a required course. But on the other hand, what about the truth of everything else that we say in the Creed, especially the truth about the resurrection of Christ from the dead and our own belief in our own resurrection from the dead too? This claim of resurrection, be it Christ's or be it our own, runs squarely up against the scientific method. We all know this method because it's drummed into us from a very young age. As soon as we start to take in our first year of high school a basic science class and then move on through biology and chemistry and into physics, we attend a lab generally every week, which inculcates in us, in the exercises that we do in that lab, the scientific method, also called the empirical method or the inductive method. And what it simply means is that we observe the world and collect data from the world. We then form hypotheses in our minds that are designed to formulate causes for the data that we observe. Then we subject our hypotheses to testing to see if the hypothesis will hold up as new evidence emerges, or whether that new evidence will in fact falsify the hypothesis and we'll have to throw it out and go back to the drawing board. And then finally, the last stage of the scientific method, as we know, is when science formulates mathematical equations. Usually, we call these the laws of physics. So Newton has 3 laws, and I think the second law is force equals mass times acceleration. Einstein has a famous law, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. But now, my point here is, ladies and gentlemen, that when we deal with this claim of the resurrection of Christ from the dead, and that our own resurrection at some point in time will happen, well, this resurrection claim runs smack up against the first stage of the scientific method. That is observation. We just don't observe people rising from the dead. So, how can we believe to be true the hypothesis that Christ rose from the dead and that we too will also rise when we don't have observable data? So we really do, it seems to me, as Christians, particularly as Catholics, we need to ask, is it reasonable to believe to be true the claims of the Creed that we say on Sunday? Or is it that when we profess the Creed, we are actually shoving our human reason into exile, ignoring reason, pretending that it doesn't exist? And this, of course, would mean that our faith boils down to just plain blind faith. Or we could put this question another way. Do we believe our religion mainly because some authority has told us to believe it, like our teachers, like the good Jesuit fathers, our parents, the church? There is a noted author who has emerged in the last several years, whose name is Sam Harris. He is one of the so-called popular atheists. Sam Harris wrote a book after the events of 9/11/2001 called The End of Faith. the end of faith. And in it, Sam Harris argues that religious faith should be totally eliminated, precisely because religious faith runs against the scientific method. And the scientific method, for Sam Harris, is nothing less than the gold standard of what it means for human beings to be reasonable. And what's more, Sam Harris says, when people believe things to be true that are opposed to the scientific method, like the claims of the Nicene Creed that we say on Sunday, these very people begin to do violent things in the name of their faith, like those who in the name of their faith killed 3,000 plus innocent people in the Twin Towers at the tip of Manhattan Island on 9/11/2001. Now, there are several possible solutions to the problem about whether or not our religious faith is reasonable. But if I may, let me talk about the one that I find most intriguing. It is developed by William James, the 19th century, early 20th century psychologist and philosopher. He was professor at Harvard, and he was the brother of the noted novelist Henry James, some of whose novels have been made into really fine movies. Now, William James argues that it is indeed compellingly reasonable that in matters of religious faith, people should believe things to be true that the scientific method cannot demonstrate to be true. And what's more, he says, we should even believe our faith when the scientific method shows that what our faith believes to be true may be downright unreasonable to believe. So let me briefly describe how he argues for that bold thesis. First, James draws a key distinction between the nature of scientific hypotheses on the one hand and the nature of religious hypotheses on the other hand. There is a key difference between them. Religious hypotheses, like those contained in our Sunday Creed that we profess to believe to be true, they are defined by three qualities. They are living, momentous, and forced, whereas scientific hypotheses are none of these. Now let me define each of those terms. Living means that each of us must be vitally interested in whether religion is true or not. If, for instance, we say, well, I'm not particularly interested in whether my faith is true or not, James would say in response, well, you haven't thought through what religious faith means and what it is all about. We must be vitally interested in our faith because religious hypotheses are what he calls momentous. This means that the whole destiny and purpose of every human person who has ever lived or who will ever live is at stake in whether religious hypotheses are true or not. This is because religious faith offers salvation. What's that mean? That means an eternal life of blessedness. And achieving this eternal blessedness would be the very purpose of every human life. Now, of course, those of you who've read some basic philosophy will know that there are philosophies like Plato's, 4th century before Christ, that can claim and show on the basis of an argument that there is a life after death. But no philosophy, I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, no philosophy offers what Christianity claims to be true, and that is an eternal life of happiness, free of all suffering, filled with joy in the presence of a personal God who loves human beings unconditionally and whose love will totally fulfill our every deepest longing precisely in our resurrected and glorified body. If this promise that Christianity professes to be true is real, no reasonable person could possibly not find it both momentous and living. But even more importantly for William James, religious hypotheses are forced. Now, this is most important because it means that in order for us to be saved and to enjoy the reward of salvation that Christianity offers, we must each make a personal decision about whether to believe the claims of the Creed or not. Now, to show why religious hypotheses are forced, let's take the case of agnostic persons. Agnostic persons refuse either to believe or disbelieve religious hypotheses. Now, they refuse to believe or disbelieve because they can't find the evidence in observation, which is the first stage, as we know, of the scientific method. They can't find the evidence in observation either to prove the claims of the Creed to be true or not to be true. And so the agnostics will say that they will wait until they do find the evidence, one way or the other, before they either believe or disbelieve. Well, now, on the surface, agnosticism perhaps looks like a perfectly reasonable position, even a compellingly reasonable position. It is, after all, as we have seen, the position of Sam Harris. But for William James, agnosticism has a major flaw. It boils down to atheism. Why? Because if the claims of religious faith turn out to be true, and if agnostics have not believed them, then there is no way that agnostics will be given the reward that comes with believing them. That reward, remember, is salvation, and eternal life of blessedness that is the whole meaning of life. Put another way, if God exists, God will surely not grant salvation to agnostics who have hedged their bets by not actively believing in God. So neither the agnostic nor the atheist will be saved, says James, because neither one took the risk to believe, and in light of their belief, to make all the sacrifices necessary in this life that people of faith must make in order for their faith to be authentic. So then, what is the bottom line of William James's argument as opposed to Sam Harris's argument? The bottom line is this: even if the claims that we profess in our Sunday Creed are unreasonable according to the scientific method, claims especially like the resurrection of Christ from the dead and the resurrection of our own bodies at the end of time, nonetheless, it is one of the most reasonable things that we human beings can do still to believe them. Why? Because what we believe and what we profess of a Sunday in the Creed is living, momentous, and forced. If we do not believe them, and they are true, then we have lost the entire meaning of life. We have forfeited the destiny of the human person. We have turned our back on an eternal life of blessedness. Now, as a little word of explanation, I would mention that William James is building on the famous argument of the 17th century French thinker and mathematician, Blaise Pascal. Pascal developed a wager. Now, a wager, as we know, is a bet that we make on the basis of the odds or probability of an outcome. So we bet on horses, getting more money for our bet, the less likely the horse is to win, if, in fact, the horse does indeed win. And so Pascal argues, even if the odds are low that Christianity's hypotheses are true, still the reasonable person will believe them. Because if we don't believe them, and they are true, we have, as James says, forfeited our destiny, turned our back on eternal life of resurrected joy and happiness. So let me offer then, ladies and gentlemen, just a brief final word. The scientific method cannot offer us salvation. To those who say that it is reasonable to wait until they have compelling, observable evidence before they believe, we can only say in response that your waiting will cost you most dearly. And for you to risk paying what could turn out to be literally a damnable cost by not believing. Believing, then, in our faith, believing it to be true, and professing it proudly on a Sunday in the Creed is the most reasonable thing that we can do. Well, I'm used to speaking to, undergraduates, as I say. I've done that for 30 years at Georgetown, and I'm quite used to fielding hostile questions, skeptical questions. I realize that there's a group from the University of Chicago called the Skeptics who are here present. I need to commend you to my nephew, who's a sophomore at the University of Chicago. I think he'd fit in right with your group as a skeptic himself. So should I take some questions, Danny? If anyone wishes to ask one, or make a comment. The question is, if I could restate it this way, I hope I'm doing your question good service. Pascal's wager, which William James is building upon, how authentic really is this as a guide to faith? Because who really can make an authentic act of faith in the living God and all of the claims of the living God, and enter into a deep and profound existential relationship with the living God in faith merely by acting on a wager? Because a wager is a sort of cold intellectual act, and it lacks, in a sense, the depth of feeling of trust and of humility that most of us understand faith to require and to embody. So this is a very good argument. This is a very good argument and a very good counterpoint to Pascal. So how would I reply to that? I would say I don't believe that Pascal in his wager is actually advocating that the fullness of faith be based only on the outcome of a cool and calculating wager. I think he would be opposed to that. He did, after all, have the great saying that is written in his Pensées, his thoughts, published as a book. The heart has its reasons that reason knows not of. And so Pascal was not a cold calculating wager maker, but he did believe, of course, that faith required that depth of feeling and trust and humility that all of us associate with authentic faith. Still, what does the wager do? The wager, if you will, takes on the naive and superficial claims of the agnostic. Now, the agnostic, as I say, puts forth a position that would claim that the position of the agnostic is the most intellectually credible and the most morally idealistic, because it claims, until I find compelling evidence to believe the claims of faith, I will neither believe nor disbelieve. So therefore, I, as the agnostic, maintain my intellectual integrity and credibility, and in maintaining my intellectual integrity and credibility, at the same time, I reveal myself to be a person of high moral standards. Now, what the wager does is cut that down to size, cut that right in half, because it argues that even if the probability of the claims that we profess in the Creed to be true are in fact true, even if there is a low probability that they are true, I'm not saying that there is a low probability. I'm saying even if, for the sake of argument, there is a low probability of their being true, the reasonable person will not be an agnostic. The reasonable person will still believe, because when there is the smallest chance of gaining the whole purpose of human existence, the whole purpose of history, the final destiny, right, for which all human beings at some place in the depth of their being yearn for, if there is the smallest chance that that is possible in a life of blessedness with a God who loves unconditionally and who will glorify our mortal bodies, bathing them with his perfect love and goodness, even if there is just a slim possibility, it would be worth all manner of sacrifices in this life to live a life that would lead to attaining that. So really, I think that's so I admit that the premise of your question I acknowledge fully, and say that Pascal would not say that acting on a wager is sufficient for faith, but he would say it is sufficient to cut away the superficial argument of agnostics who claim the moral and intellectual high ground. Shall I put on my hat now as a Catholic priest? The answer to that, certainly from the point of view of Catholic teaching or Catholic doctrine, is we have such a thing. We Catholics believe that there is only one way to be saved, and that is through baptism. The Church stands by that. However, there are three modes of baptism. The most usual mode is, of course, when we take our children to church and have them baptized at the baptismal font, right, in the Trinitarian formula. The second is if someone should not be baptized in that way, but should give a witness of martyrdom to the Christian faith, should die as a martyr for Christ, like the holy innocents that we see in the Gospel of Luke. That's a form of baptism. But by far the most common form of baptism, which the Church fully acknowledges, is called baptism of desire. And what that means is that when people, through no fault of their own, do not either know about the Christian faith, do not know about Christ, or they do not, because they have grown up in a particular culture, in a particular society, in a particular religion with its whole nexus, of loyalties and communitarian relationships, even if they have heard about Christ, but still believe in their conscience to be faithful to the truth as they honestly and sincerely know it, that is a form of baptism. And those folks can be saved. Why should anybody believe in the God of Jesus Christ? Well, there are many things that one could say about that. One could say that the God of Jesus Christ, as opposed to any other religion that I know of, that I have studied or read about, the God of Jesus Christ has entered into the deepest relationship with sinful human beings. That the God of Jesus Christ has... Do we have a crucifix in this room? I mean, this is the problem we have in Georgetown. You know, I can rarely find a crucifix. There's a crucifix. The God of Jesus Christ has become a human being just like us and allowed us to do that to him out of love. I don't know of any other religion that humanity has ever been present to human beings that has demonstrated a God of such self-sacrifice that he would take the form of a slave and allow us to crucify him, and on the other end, redeem us in and through it. You know, in Islam, for instance, I was just talking to one of my students in one of my classes at Georgetown who's a very fine and very smart Muslim. And I was saying to him, the word Islam, doesn't that mean submit? He said, oh, yes, it means submit. And 5 times a day, we submit, right, in prayer to Islam. I am not criticizing Islam, but I am pointing out a contrast between, say, Islam, which has almost nearly as many adherents as Christianity does, and our own Christian faith. We don't use the word submit in Christianity because what did Jesus say to us? What does the Gospel of St. John say? I who have died on the cross and been crucified for you, laid down my life for you. I call you friend. Is there any religion on the face of humanity where God does not demand submission because of his all-holiness, when in fact he could demand submission because he is all-holy? But he calls us friend. That's why I believe in the God of Jesus Christ.